All right, I'm told we've got the venue for an hour, so I'm going to kick off here, even though this looks a little bit like the room looks when I'm teaching a class at 8 in the morning, which is to say it's trickling in a wee bit. But for those of you who don't know me, how do you do? I'm Dave Carney. I've been teaching at Case for about 20 years right now. And I'm here today, number one, because our development office schedules things 9 months in advance, but does so really, really well. And so they stuck me on the day after Election Day without me even realizing it. I was checking my kids' spring break catalog. But more importantly, I've been meddling in election law in Ohio for a good 30 years now. In fact, I did hanging chads in a Republican congressional primary back in 1992 when I was still practicing law, and 2 Republican congressmen tied and incidentally started Ted Strickland's career because they tied and fought so bitterly that Ted Strickland was able to come in and take over that district. I want to talk a little bit today about all the various fights that have happened factually over what swing state Ohio is about. And I think in terms of the evidence of what's happened and what's been passed, I think we can reach really pretty easy conclusions about what happened and unintended consequences and lots of fun things. And then I'm going to venture widely off into the stratosphere, and we're going to talk about what this means legally. And in shorthand, no one knows, because the Supreme Court hasn't gotten around to answering a lot of the interesting questions here, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So I want to talk mostly about voter ID and voter fraud and claims of election rigging and election stealing and things like that, and talk about what's real, talk about what's not, and talk about what's politics a little bit. This background on this didn't come out quite as dark as I thought it would when I was looking at it on my computer, but Tufts University a couple years ago did something called the 11 Nations Project, and you can see the 11 nations in different colors up there on the background screens. And what they posited was that there are 11 kind of different cultural identities that the United States has. And when you zoom in on Ohio and take a look at it, Northeast Ohio, coincidentally not the Western Reserve as it were, is a part of Yankeedom. Walk out to Chagrin Falls, you're looking at Connecticut. You go down to mid-Ohio, and really we're culturally Iowa, we're culturally mid-Pennsylvania through there. And then as you venture south, you're really talking about Appalachia. And coincidentally, you look at last night's results and you look at the Kasich-Trump breakdown, and Donald Trump won all of Appalachia. He won the entire eastern strip of Ohio right through the Ohio River Valley. Kasich won everything outside the hills. So, you know, another indication of that. But in many ways, we're the most average state there is, quite literally. If you look at black-white breakdowns, if you look at how Ohio is broken down, city, suburb, farm, et cetera, in method after method, in measure after measure, we are incredibly average. But with one exception. As the country gets more and more Hispanic, as the foreign-born population increases, as we demographically change, the things that Ohio lags on, we're getting older, we're not very Hispanic, and we have a much lower percentage of foreign-born than the nation does, and that's only going to become more and more true. So while we're the bellwether right now and have been really since 1900, that's going to change over the next 30 years, and chances are Ohio's not going to be the quintessential battleground state 25 years from now. But boy, we are now. Since 1896, Ohio has not voted for the winner of the presidential election only twice. And one of those comes with an asterisk, because in 1944, Thomas Dewey beat FDR here, but he beat him mostly because of his vice presidential candidate, Governor John Bricker, known to most of us legal nerds as Bricker and Eckler. But the only other exception, and a fairly big one, is that Ohio went pretty heavily for Nixon, and we weren't typical. But that's the exception that proves the rule, because when you look at it, in each of these 3 breakdowns that are up there on the board, Ohio is the most typical state in the country. So in other words, if you measure what the national margin was and then you look at the Ohio margin, since 1900, no other state has been that consistently close to the national average. And if you look at then the numbers since 64 and since 80, the numbers keep getting smaller and smaller. So, since we're the ultimate battleground state, that means we swing back and forth a lot. And these are the Secretary of State's numbers showing you total number of registered voters in Ohio over the years since 2000, total number of votes cast, and turnout. And actually, I was a little surprised when I pulled up this data. I was expecting the turnout numbers to be a little bit different in presidential elections. When you talk to the presidential campaign folks, they always say, well, it's all about turnout, and it is. But if you look at the presidential races up here in 0, 4, 8, and 12, the turnout's relatively consistent and it doesn't track that much with red and blue. But turnout does matter. Look at the 6 and 10 races. Turnout's much lower in those presidential off years. But in 2006, that was a Democratic wave. We had 53 turnout. That gave us Strickland. That gave us, Jennifer Brunner in the Secretary of State's office. You get to 2010 and 2014, you get massive Republican victories in statewide office and statewide things. And that's mostly a function of voter turnout. If turnout's low, Republicans, who tend to turn out no matter what, are going to have an advantage in Ohio. If turnout's high, the marginal voters tend to be Democrats, and that gives the Democratic Party a huge advantage. Consequence of this, when you're swinging back and forth, is that close elections in swing states matter. And, I think everyone remembers this gentleman. He said he still gets stopped in the supermarket. I was reading an interview with him from a couple years ago, and he said people still randomly accost him in the supermarket and go, "You're the hanging Chad guy." And he's like, yeah. But as a result of the disaster that Florida was in 2000, and I think everybody from both parties would acknowledge that Florida was a disaster, the bottom line, Florida was a tie. We don't know who won Florida. You can make a passionate argument either way on that. But the fact of the matter is that with the voting equipment we were using back in 2000, we had an error rate, even assuming good faith on all participants' parts, we had an error rate of at least 2%, and the final margin was something like 0.01%. So who knows who really won? I mean, I have my candidate who I suggest really won, but that tends to correlate with my own political preferences pretty well, and that's true of almost all of us. But one consequence of the colossal mess in 2000 is that we all agreed we don't ever want to go through this again. And so there was actually a bipartisan consensus to fix our electoral voting system. And we wanted to not have this concern that politics was determining who was president. We wanted to not have partisan warfare, and that's why things have gotten so much better since 2000. But in 2002, we passed this Help America Votes Act, and it was the ultimate kind of exercise in good intentions. We set national minimum standards for voter ID, trying to kind of echo this Bush v. Gore concern that we want to play by the same rules wherever we can. Congress agreed to pay for better voting technology, electronic voting machines, optical scanners, no more butterfly ballots, no more hanging chads, no more missed votes, these kind of things. So we're going to improve our voting technology, national provisional ballot standards. So if you did show up and for some reason your name wasn't on the list of registered voters, you could cast a provisional ballot and you had 7 to 10 days to actually fix it. And it's hard to think about this now with the way that we fight about elections. But this was an utterly non-controversial bill back in 2002. It passed with substantial majorities in both parties. Everybody agreed with it. Everybody thought it was a great idea. Everybody gave speeches, and you know, whenever everybody in Washington agrees that something is a good idea, you pretty much know it's going to be an unmitigated train wreck.
Can I just interrupt a little bit?
Sure.
When you talked about 2% error rate, was that true in like those old mechanical machines when
When-
they voted the first time
when-
40 years ago?
I actually don't know the error rate for the old voting machines. They were subject to vote. They were subject to breakdown, and they failed a lot. I don't know what their error rate was on votes cast, but I know that on punch card ballots nationwide, the error rate was about 2%. So we get to 2004, Ohio again, the swing state. Ohio again, a state that mattered, as we're going to get to in another one of my slides here. 2004, Bush wound up beating Kerry by about 130,000 votes. That wound up making the difference in the Electoral College. And we had a colossal train wreck of awful. So first, the Kerry campaign got the bright idea that it was going to really push voter registration, and watching this happen, so too did the Bush campaign. With the consequence that we added 800,000 registered voters in the presidential election. And if you go back a little bit here, look at that spike in 4. You know, number of registered voters in Ohio has moved up a little bit over the years. But boy, you go from 7.1 registered voters in November of 2002 to 7.9 million registered voters in November of 2004. And here's the bad part. Most of that 800,000 was September of 2004, was in those last few minutes. Now, this had some unintended consequences. So, 800,000 new voters get added to the rolls. We are trying and failing to implement the new voting technology that the Help America Votes Act. Most of you will probably remember the controversies about Diebold electric voting machines and things like that. And you know, everybody's like, well, it's the age of the internet. We're going to get these newfangled electronic voting machines. They're going to work great. People start spending money on these things in 3. And then all of a sudden, people start publishing videos about how you can hack the damn things and how the software isn't secure. And so, again, death by good intention. People are like, well, we have a contract ready to buy all these electronic voting machines, but we're worried they might be unreliable, so let's cancel the contract. We'll just do one more election with the old voting technology. But since it's the old voting technology, and since we know we're going to replace it anyway, we won't actually maintain the old technology or fix the old machines or remind our poll workers about how to use the old machines or train people, with the result that we had in just about every county in Ohio, we had a mismatch of electric voting, of the optical scan voters, the little bubble votes that you used yesterday to vote with. A few people still had the Diebold machines around Columbus especially. We had all this brand new high tech. And of course, as you know from going to the polls, your typical poll worker is generally speaking a 22-year-old internet enthusiast. So we had a group of, if I can be so nasty, little old ladies who run the polling places and who've been running the polling places for their entire lives, trying to implement this new mismatch of new technology with, by the way, all of the new protection rules. So the provisional ballot rules were new, and the new expanded voter registration rules were new, and the voter ID rules were new, and the technology was a mess. And so what happens? This happens. I remember the weather on 2004 really, really well because I spent it kind of doing a circle around East Cleveland, Cleveland Heights, and Shaker Heights in the lovely 34-degree rainy weather that it was falling on us in 2004. And naturally, Murphy's Law being what it was, we had people waiting outside in that stuff for 3 and 4 and 5 hours to vote. Kenyon University holds the prize. Kenyon actually had 11-hour waits. Thank God it was college students, because anybody else would have been killed by that kind of a wait, I think, in that weather. But at any rate, huge lines, huge numbers of people who came with an hour to vote, were told there was a 3-hour wait, went home. People's estimate of how many people gave up and didn't vote vary wildly depending on which political party you're affiliated with. But I think everybody agrees that there were at least 100,000 people who got in line, saw the line, said, oh my God, we can't do this. We're also using the old bad punch card technology. There were about 100,000 votes where people voted in the presidential election but didn't vote for president because they missed the hole, or they double punched the hole, or there was a hanging chad that got stuck in the hole. So we had at least 100,000 votes that were cast in the presidential election of '04 that did not register a vote for either Bush or for Kerry. We have a huge raft of new registrants. But people didn't show up to the right polling place. People didn't get postcards telling them what their polling place was. We were also trying to purge the voter rolls, as the statutes require. If you haven't voted in 2 or 3 elections, you're kicked off. Upshot of that was about a quarter of the people who showed up to vote in 2004 were told, sorry, we don't have any record of you being registered. So millions and millions of people had tangles and difficulties and things like that. That produced a lot of charges from the folks who lost that this was the result of fraud. Robert F. Kennedy wrote a very, very famous magazine article that went all over the internet, kind of making all of these somewhat feverish accusations that Bush had stolen the election from Kerry. And most of them involved the conspiracy by that Republican Party machine, Cuyahoga County, to frustrate the vote. And I still remember my very favorite piece of his evidence was that he pointed out that there was a precinct in the eastern side of Cleveland that had voted 820 votes in 2000 and had no votes in 2004, and how could this be? As it happens, I knew that precinct reasonably well. I'd been on the Cleveland School Board once upon a time. That was a senior high-rise, Section 8, that had been torn down to make way for a new parking lot for the Cleveland Clinic. And lo and behold, once it was a parking lot, not all that many people voted in that precinct anymore. But Kennedy was like, there must be fraud going on here. It's that Cuyahoga County Republican. And I'm like, have you ever set foot in Cuyahoga County, guy? But lots and lots of people waited. Lots and lots of vote was a mess. Absolutely no question that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of votes weren't counted. The harder question, and I think the question that I think has a fairly easy answer is, was it a huge partisan split on who didn't get counted? I think the answer to that is no. So if you take that 25% of people whose registrations got fouled up, that was across the country. That was across the whole state. And if you're trying to tell me that somebody, in Bucyrus wasn't registered, but that must be a Kerry voter, it's like, well, have you looked at the count? Have you looked at the vote turnout in those places? So the registration turnouts, the spoiled ballots, all those things, almost certainly were split 50-50 between Bush and Kerry. The lines were concentrated in areas where there's lots of voters per precinct. The lines are concentrated in areas where there were lots of new registrants. So the line almost certainly favored Bush. People who gave up were probably going to vote for Kerry. But, if you figure 150,000 people gave up and went home, even on the east side of Cleveland, even in Shaker Heights, Kerry wasn't winning with 100% of the vote. You can't really say, oh, that's an outcome flip. But at any rate, after Ohio kind of reenacts the mess that is Florida, and in some ways botches it even worse than Florida did. I mean, we were lucky it was a 100,000 vote margin, right? Because if we'd have had a 1,000 vote margin in Ohio, we would have been reenacting the entire Florida recount, the entire Florida fight right down the bat, because if it's a 1,000 vote margin, who the hell knows who won the state, and therefore who the hell knows who won the presidency? So again, we had another flare-up of bipartisanship. Everybody agreed, hey, this can't happen. And Ohio passed, quite frankly, one of the most generous early voting schemes in the country. Again, bipartisan basis, the Republicans, the Democrats all agreed on this. We fought about who was going to pay how much for keeping the boards of elections open and things like that. But on the big picture, 35 days of early voting, evening hours, weekend hours, vote the 3 days before the election. We had a golden week. Golden week, there was a 1 week period of time where you could show up at the Board of Elections, register to vote, and cast your vote that same day. Voting on Sundays for people who work during the week. And it worked. By every measure, this has been a huge success. Oh, and importantly, we also passed no-fault absentee vote at that same time. So until these voting reforms, you actually had to sign an affidavit that said, I'm going to be out of the state, or I'm going to be in the hospital, or I have a reason that I need an early ballot. No-fault absentee now. You want an absentee ballot? Ask for it. What's your reason? I don't feel like walking. Okay, good enough. And something like, it varies a little bit from year to year, but something like a third of the people in Ohio now take advantage of one form or another of this early voting. Republicans tend to vote absentee. Democrats tend to vote early in person. But by and large, everybody uses it. And here's where it gets concentrated. So remember the lines from '04? Catastrophic lines in the Columbus area, catastrophic lines in the Cleveland area. Guess which two counties vote most heavily, both on a percentage basis and on a number basis? And no one, not even me standing this close, can read these numbers. This stuff's out of the Bliss Institute down at the University of Akron, by the way. They do a lot of really good work on elections law in Ohio. But when you zoom in on this, there were in this 2008, 265,000 early votes in Cleveland, 250,000 early votes in Columbus, and the next highest total is Cincinnati, but only 110,000. So twice as many people vote early in Cleveland and in Columbus as vote in Cincinnati. And for those of you who are political enthusiasts, and if you're here at 8:30 in the morning, and morning after Election Day, I'm going to guess this probably is most of my audience, right? What do we know about? Well, that means, we got a lot of Democrats voting early, and the Republicans are like, meh. And the Barack Obama campaign was much, much more ruthlessly organized than the somewhat hapless Kerry campaign was. With the result that the Obama campaign took incredible advantage of that golden week. Why bother turning out a voter twice when you could just load them on a bus, get them down to the Board of Election once, and they're voted and they're counted, and we win. They took incredible advantage of Sunday voting, souls to the polls. African American churches lined everybody up and said, all right, everybody, church isn't over yet. We're going to go worship down at the Board of Elections. Everybody on the bus. And huge, huge lines. I remember the weekend before the election, you drove down past the Board of Elections in Cleveland, and there were lines around the block. And for those of us of my ideological predisposition, I was going, yes, this is very good news, right? Well, Republicans can count too. They saw those lines around the block on the Saturday before the election day. They saw how close the election was, and they went, wait a minute, this isn't such a good deal for us. And as it happens, we just took over the state legislature. We just took over the Secretary of State's office. We need to stop this stuff, because if we don't stop this stuff, Ohio's going to go blue on us, damn it. Oh, one more thing. This slide's out of place, but I was finishing it too late last night. This one's out of Ohio State. A couple of people in the Poli-Sci and Law Department did this study. This is, as all of you will recognize, a map of Cuyahoga County. The darker the shade on the map, the darker the shade in reality, if I may. This is concentration of African American voters per census tract. And so, sure enough, the African American vote in Cuyahoga County tends to concentrate right here in this loop. And red dots are in-person early voting. So who votes early in person in Cuyahoga County? If you added in absentee, by the way, the red would be much more balanced. But who votes in person in Cuyahoga County? Well, no accident, it's most of those same people who spent 4 hours in line in 2004 and said to themselves, I'm never doing this bleep again as long as I live. So, General Assembly takes over and they say, you know what? You know that bipartisan early voting stuff we passed? It turns out to be not such a good deal for those of us who are Republicans. We need to rein it back a little bit. So they got rid of the Golden Week. People want to vote, they should actually have to show up twice, gosh darn it. Cut back from 35 days to 28, eliminated Sunday voting, eliminated evening voting, eliminated voting those last 3 days before the elections, passed somewhat more stringent voter ID, although frankly Ohio's voter ID is pretty weak tea compared to some of the more egregious ones in places like Texas and North Carolina. And complying with Bush v. Gore, remember, same procedure everywhere in the state, every county must be open for the same number of early votes. So if you're in Defiance County with 50 early votes and you're in Cuyahoga County with 400,000 early votes, you have the same number of hours for early voting. Well, now we reach the end of things we know anything about. Now we're in the realm of let's speculate in a wild-ass fashion, because here's the problem. The Supreme Court has never said what the rules are for this. When voter ID started, the Supreme Court heard a facial equal protection challenge to the Indiana voter ID law. So without any proof that it disproportionately affected African Americans, without any proof that people weren't able to get ballots, the claim was, this is an equal protection violation. Poor folks, black folks won't be able to vote as frequently, as easily. Therefore, we have to strike this down. Supreme Court, pretty easily, 6-3, said, nah. State says they're worried about voter fraud. Granted, there's no actual evidence of voter fraud, but they're worried about voter fraud, and we are required to defer to a legislative stated motive. And there's no actual evidence of racially disparate impact. Nobody testified I couldn't vote because I didn't have an ID. And so therefore, in Crawford, Supreme Court said this is all perfectly fine. Voter fraud is a perfectly legitimate reason to impose regulations on the voting process. And once that opinion came down, every partisan-minded Republican legislator around the country said, I see a way to get some votes. And so here's the interesting question we don't know the answer to. You're allowed to rig the deck to favor your political party. Partisan gerrymandering, as long as it doesn't cross especially egregious lines, that's perfectly fine. That's the American way. Democrats rig the game for Democrats, Republicans rig the game for Republicans. That's what we do. You're not allowed to rig the deck racially. In the age of Obama, when African Americans are voting 90+% with one political party, what do we do with a regulation that disfavors Democrats and favors Republicans? Do we think of that as a partisan regulation? In which case, unless it's truly egregious, it's fine. Do we think of that as a racial classification? In which case, it may or may not be fine. And my official law professor answer for this on this is, I have no freaking idea what we're going to do. I didn't have any freaking idea what the Supreme Court was going to do with this when Scalia was alive. When Scalia was alive, there were pretty clearly 3 votes that said, look, defer to the legislature, keep our business the hell out of it. Voting Rights Act is a historical artifact, and this was in the Shelby County case from a couple years ago, where they struck down Section 5, the pre-clearance stuff throughout the Old South. They said, look, there's no reason, there's no showing of current ongoing racial animus in places like Alabama that now have 60% black votes. You know, you can't impose a one-size-fits-all regulation like that. If Congress wants to pass a more targeted law, they can, and the Republicans in control of Congress said, no thanks, we're kind of good. So Section 5's gone. That leaves us with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act says if something has a racially disparate effect, it can be prohibited. So that sounds like good old disparate impact analysis, but it's not, because there's a bunch of Section 2 cases out there on things like felon voting. And disenfranchising felons has a huge disparate impact. It tends to disenfranchise many more black voters proportionately than white voters. And every court that has looked at that pretty much unanimously has said, that's fine. 14th Amendment allows you to strike people's right to vote for being convicted of a crime. It's right there in the 14th Amendment. And it's not our business to make those choices for legislatures. It can't just be an effect. It's got to be something more than that. Well, what more than that? And the answer, again, we don't know. Supreme Court's gonna decide this within 2, 3, 4 years. We have opinions now from the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th Circuit, from Ohio, North Carolina, Texas, and Wisconsin, the 4 kind of lead states on voter ID on this. And the 6th Circuit and the 4th Circuit have both said, no, look, if there's historical evidence of discrimination and you're passing a law that has an impact like this, that's not permissible. And this, in fact, is from one of the studies that the 6th Circuit relied on in affirming Economist's injunction against the restrictions on Ohio early voting. And within about a week of the 6th Circuit affirming that, Supreme Court stayed it. Said, nope, reinstate the early voting. But their reason for reinstating it was Supreme Court's got a doctrine that says don't tamper with election rules right before an election. And they did the same thing with the 7th Circuit, which came down the other way. The 7th Circuit affirmed the voter ID challenge, said yes, all of these voter IDs should go into effect. Supreme Court 2 days later slapped it down and said, nope, make it go away. And we don't know the lineups on all of these stays are without opinion. The lineups on them, by and large, are 6-3. And the three Democratic women who were on the bench at that point, and Scalia, Thomas, Alito, generally speaking, reached the partisan result. And in between, we don't know where the hell Kennedy and Roberts and folks like that are on this. We're going to find out. There's a voter ID trial going on right now in North Carolina. Ohio has kind of reached a reluctant in-between on this, which is to say we brought back election, the court ordered that election voting the 3 days before the election had to come back. They ordered that at least some evening hours had to be imposed. They ordered that you couldn't completely shut down Sunday voting, but the Golden Week is gone. Every county has to have the same hours under Bush v. Gore, and Husted's ruling on that has been upheld as well. So we don't know. It's going to be very, very interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with this, and it's going to be very, very interesting to see who Obama announces this morning at 11 as the justice that he wants to replace Scalia, because it's fairly clear that if Obama gets somebody he wants on this, the odds are quite good that this kind of thing is going to be found to be a violation of the Voting Rights Act. And if the Republicans get in this fall and they get their justice on there, I think the odds of this being unconstitutional or being a violation of the Voting Rights Act, rather, drop quite a bit. So how's that for legal education? I don't know what the hell the law is, and neither do you. See? So you've now learned so much. So with that, I'm told we have to get out of here, so I will shut up and I will let you guys ask any questions. Yeah?
Hang on for the mic, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about the lawsuits that were filed last week with respect to the 17-year-old voting. Can you just talk a little bit both about sort of the policy prior to the lawsuits and then what happened?
I don't know that I can talk about the policy prior to the lawsuits too much. I mean, let me. So Secretary of State Husted issued a ruling back in December that said 17-year-olds are not allowed to vote in presidential primaries. And his take on that was everybody agrees that 17-year-olds are allowed to vote in a nominating contest. So every 17-year-old in Ohio was allowed to vote in the Ted Strickland P.G. Sittenfeld race for Senate, because that is the winner of that race is the Democratic nominee, and 17-year-olds who are going to be 18 in November should get a choice on that. Everybody agrees on that. Everybody also agrees that if there was a school levy or a tax levy on the ballot yesterday, a 17-year-old who will be 18 in November is not allowed to vote on that. Similarly, if there was a pro tem election, if somebody dies or resigns and you're filling a term on city council for 6 months, that's a person who is an actual elected official. 17-year-olds aren't allowed to actually elect people. You're only allowed to nominate people. So Husted's take is, when you vote in a presidential primary, you're not nominating, you're electing a delegate. And yeah, when you cast your vote for Kasich yesterday, you were really casting your vote for Bob from the butcher shop, who's going to go to Cleveland this summer and vote for Kasich. And he's obligated to vote for Kasich the first time through. But if there's no first ballot winner, he becomes an elected official free to cast his own vote. And Husted's take on it, and I have to say, of all the things I disagree with Husted on, I'm not sure I wildly disagree with him on this. He says, look, if you have a second ballot, well, I'm imagining that this is what he says. He's been very careful not to actually put his rationale down in writing, so I'm putting words in his mouth here, but I think these are the words he would pick. He says, look, when you get to a second ballot in Cleveland this summer at the Republican National Convention, that's somebody who you elected to make choices for you, and frankly, that choice is probably a lot more important than who's on the East Cleveland School Board. That's a final election, and therefore, you can't vote in a presidential primary because you're not really voting for the candidate, you're voting for the delegate. And then Husted said something that I thought was just wildly wrong. He said, and we've always done it this way. He said, ask Blackwell. Back in 12, we did it that way. Ask Jennifer Bruner. She had the same rule. Well, it certainly was never my understanding when I was working on these elections, but there was an article in the Dayton Daily News a couple of days after he made this ruling quoting a, quote, longtime Ohio election official. Who the hell that is, I don't know. But it was somebody who the reporter said had been on a county board of election for 30-some years. And that official said, oh, he's right. We've always thrown 17-year-old presidential ballots in the trash. And my reaction to that was, what? I think that was the federal judge or the state court judge in Columbus's reaction to it too. The General Assembly revised the rules in '81. They said that 17-year-olds are allowed to vote in primaries. I was 17 in 1981, and I remember them passing that law, and certainly what I thought they were doing was giving me the right to vote in presidential primaries, because what the heck other primary do you care about? And pretty quickly, a lot more quickly than I would have expected, trial court judge held a TRO hearing, granted an order, said, no, that's ridiculous, count the 17-year-olds' votes. and Husted said he wasn't going to appeal it. Would have been very interesting. The reason I suspect that Brunner hasn't offered any public statement about what her policy is that she currently sits on the 10th District Court of Appeals down in Columbus that would hear the appeal from this thing, and so therefore she's quite sensibly keeping her mouth shut about it. I'm a little disturbed by that 30-year election official saying, oh yeah, we've always thrown away presidential ballots. I think it's a fight about, meaning versus technicality of what a statute means. I always think of a presidential primary as picking a presidential candidate. If you look at it that way, then yeah, a 17-year-old should vote.
So the upshot then yesterday was that 17-year-olds could cast their votes, but who the heck knows if they actually got counted?
Oh no, the court's order was pretty clear on that. The court's order was, you will count 17-year-old presidential votes. And Husted announced he wasn't going to fight about that. Sure.
The first is my very simplistic look at just the ballot. The ballot has the candidates' names. It
Right.
doesn't say delegate or delegate for the candidate.
Yeah, there were a couple of lawsuits filed about it. I read the one that the Sanders campaign filed down in Columbus that resulted in the injunction. They made a very, very big deal of the fact that as a matter of state law, you're not allowed to see the name of the delegate you're allegedly voting for. State law mandates that the only thing you see is the presidential candidate's name. And that was a good solid 4 or 5 pages of their brief. Is come on. This is a final election, but it's a secret candidate.
Well, it's been decades since I was a delegate, but I wasn't identified until well after the primary, if that makes any difference.
Well, I'm not sure that that's still true. I know that the slates of delegates were selected, at least on the Democratic side, back in January, December, somewhere in there. So I have several friends who are delegates. I don't know if, depending on how many votes your candidate gets, whether you get tagged as a delegate depends how far down the list you work.
Well, another question regarding the 17-year-old votes. Just mechanically, how did they go about destroying the ballots? I mean, you're standing there, they may look at your driver's license, see your age, but you stand there and hand your ballot to someone who's feeding it into the scanner. Are they going to rip it up in front of you?
No, I would imagine that they somehow tagged 17-year-old ballots for special processing somehow because, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. As it happens, the way my age group, I never voted as a 17-year-old, and I don't think I've ever actually sat in a precinct where it happens. It's not a ton of votes. In the last presidential election, I think there were 3,000 17-year-olds who voted in the primaries total.
Voter ID. I just so happen to have voted yesterday, and so I know that voter ID for me was driver's license.
Right.
And there was a list of other kinds of voter IDs that
Yeah.
were allowed. So what is is the issue thou shalt not have any voter ID, or what's wrong with the list voter IDs that they had?
My take, there's not a whole lot wrong with Ohio's list because Ohio's list is relatively generous. So it's, it is a Ohio driver's license, if memory serves, and I'm doing this off the top of my head without checking it, so call me out if I get it wrong, but I think if it's even an expired driver's license, as long as the address hasn't changed, it's okay. You can use a utility bill that shows your current address as ID. And there's 3 or 4 other categories that let you identify yourself. That's a relatively easy to comply with set of things, but even with that list, there's something like, and again, numbers will vary depending on which side of the ledger you're on here, but I think even Republicans would say that there's probably 500,000 people in Ohio who can't meet that ID requirement or who at least don't have a valid driver's license. If you talk to Democrats studying that, the estimates go up to 900,000 to 1 million out of something like 7 million registered voters. So that's a decent chunk of the electorate. And if you're somebody who moves frequently, If you are, so if you are a student or you are a renter or you are, somebody who moves from place to place fairly frequently, if you are somebody who's more transient, if you don't have a permanent fixed address because you're homeless or something like that, that very definitely gets harder and harder to comply with. For those of us who are homeowners and have lived in the same house for 20 years and have been driving for longer than that, voter ID is pretty trivial. There are some more egregious voter ID rules out there. So Wisconsin, for instance, will accept a hunting license or a gun permit, but not a student photo ID. Which has always been my favorite one, which is, your state hunting license, that's a perfectly valid ID, but your University of Wisconsin photo ID, absolutely not. And, I wonder what motivated them to make that set of choices, right? But, voter ID, what's that?
Wisconsin student ID doesn't mean you're a resident of the state, right?
Well, no, not necessarily, but, in Wisconsin and in Ohio, you can, as long as you declare that it is your intent to stay in Ohio. So, so my law students from places like New York and California can and do register to vote in Ohio. They just have to file an affidavit of domiciliary intent and say, yeah, I really do plan to stay in Ohio.
I was just explaining why the Wisconsin student ID by itself would not be sufficient to show you're living in Wisconsin.
Oh, right, but neither would necessarily a hunting license in Wisconsin, right? I could live in Chicago and go hunting deer up in Milwaukee.
Do you have the sense that the Republican Party has picked up on the get out the vote machine that Obama has had in the past?
I have no idea.
Or do the Democrats still have the advantage?
That's above my pay grade. I don't know that I have any particular insight into the Republican GOTV. I think that they have a very real sense that they got outworked and out-organized, and I know that, I know from what I read in the papers that the Republican National Committee has been putting a tremendous effort into trying to ID its voters and create databases and create email messaging and all the rest of those sorts of things that their perception is that Obama beat them at last time. I don't know how that plays, and I don't know how some of this stuff plays with the rise of Donald Trump. Because the single best predictor of somebody voting for Donald Trump is that they are a registered Democrat who hasn't voted in a Democratic primary in the last 15 years. So Dixiecrats, people who have been registered Democrats forever, but who as a practical matter have probably been voting Republican in presidential elections for one reason or another, those folks are probably less likely to have voter ID than a typical establishment Republican is. Those folks are probably less likely to vote absentee by mail than a typical Republican is. Those folks are perhaps more likely to take advantage of early voting because they're perhaps more likely to be hourly workers. So it's going to be very interesting, assuming that Trump winds up with the Republican nomination, it's going to be very interesting to see how those turnout battles go, because at that level Trump's correct. He really is bringing new people at least into the Republican primary. Consequences of that, I don't know.
On the voter registration, you said there are 800,000 new voter registrations in, I think, 2000.
In 04, yeah.
Or weren't they disproportionately Democrats?
They were somewhat more heavily Democrat, but there were an awful lot of new registrants in places that seemed to me to be unlikely to be Democratic votes. Plains of Western Ohio, things like that. Places that are not typically huge Democratic strongholds also had surges in registration voting. I haven't seen a study that I regard as something other than somebody throwing numbers at the wall about what the partisan split on those registrants is. My hunch would be that it would tend to favor the Democrats just because of the way turnout works in Ohio, but note the word hunch. I just realized I think I missed a slide here. So a little bit on the reality of voter fraud. So in 2012, and these are John Husted's own numbers, there were 5.6 million ballots cast in Ohio. Roughly 900,000 of them according to the Democratic Party estimates. So I'm quoting the Democratic Party's expert in the litigation here. But according to the Democratic Party's expert, as many as 900,000 of those folks had an ID problem. 135 cases were identified as posing problematic possible instances of fraud. And when Husted was quizzed about this, about how many of those cases could have been prevented by more aggressive voter ID, he said, well, most of these are absentee voter cases, or there's 20 double vote cases of those 135. People who voted in Ohio and apparently someone of that same name and apparent same demographic characteristics also voted in Kentucky or Michigan or Wisconsin or somewhere else, which suggests certainly that there was some kind of fraud. But if I'm registered in both New York and Ohio and I show up with my driver's license in Ohio, and since New York has no voter ID rules, I don't need to show up with my driver's ID, with my voter ID in New York, that's not something that's going to get prevented by voter ID. U.S. Department of Justice says that they have 0 known cases of fraud in the 10-year period from 2004 to 2014. That could have been prevented by voter ID. Anywhere in the country. Which of course leads me to come up with some snarky examples of things that are more common than in-person voter fraud. So attending a football game at Shea Stadium and being killed by a flying lawnmower, yes, it happened. Having a cow fall through your bedroom ceiling and kill you in bed, happened. I don't have my link on that one. And being killed by a flying fire hydrant as you walk down the sidewalk also happened. So that's not to say there's no such thing as voter fraud. There clearly is, and it's clearly possible to commit fraud using things like absentee votes, especially because, who knows who really filled out grandma's absentee ballot. Right? Especially if grandma is no longer quite as sharp as she used to be. All you need is a copy of her driver's license. You make a copy of that driver's license, you send it in, you vote for her because frankly she's always wanted to vote for that nice Bernie Sanders, and you mail it in. So, any other questions? All right, well, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
What's the law say about mental capacity to vote? How does that work? And the reason I ask that, I've worked polls for many years, and I've seen people being bussed in and voting and having their sisters vote basically for them.
Right.
And I'm trying to understand how that works.
Well, the bottom line on that is that if you believe that somebody lacks the mental capacity to make their own decisions, an election observer could technically challenge that. But boy, it's going to be awful hard to prove that. And as a practical matter, I've worked as an election observer before for various political campaigns, and I've watched, busloads of Russian immigrants get driven in and listened to the nice 45-year-old Russian lady translating and, da-da-da-da-da-da, Schwarzer, it's like, oh, okay. I think I know who you're encouraging people to vote for here. But, the mechanics of trying to prove that, you could technically challenge that. I gotta believe, unless you really have somebody who's almost in a vegetative state, you're gonna have a very hard time persuading a judge that you, as a partisan election observer, are a better and more disinterested assessor of somebody's mental state than her sister. I just think as a practical matter, that's not likely to be a winning argument. I have not, they probably have some sense of what the turnout was, but I have not, I have not spent enough time on Google to be able to answer that, so I won't. All right, well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.